I wasn't kidding when I said, fasten your seatbelts, we're going on an amazing journey. And here we are, we've reached through the 1960s, and we're about to restart in 1970. Mordecai grew up in the Jewish quarter in Montreal, and it's thanks to him that we know so much about it. He was so frank about life on St. Urban Street among Jewish families that were struggling to make it in the New World, that some outraged members of the community went so far as to accuse him of anti-Semitism. Mordecai's keen sense of irony protected him. I doubt if it protected the very rich matriarch of the Bronfman family, who was foolish enough to say patronizingly to Mordecai at a glittering Montreal party, "Well, you've done pretty well for a boy who came out of St. Urban Street." The reply has zinged down through the years. "And you've done pretty well for a bootlegger's wife." That was Mordecai, a man who took no prisoners in his novels, non-fiction pieces, and his conversation. He and I fought about some publishing thing or other, and his letters would begin wearily, "Gibson, Gibson." I believe that my delighted assistant thought that he won. That was Mordecai. He became famous for the book that he wrote in England in '59, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, which became a very successful movie and showed the human dangers of ruthless pursuit of wealth. And then, having served his own apprenticeship abroad, he returned to Canada in '72 and continued to work at his craft, turning out witty, hard-hitting novels every decade until Barney's version in 1997. It became hugely popular, not just in Canada, but in Italy, where Barney became a famous new Italian character type. Famously, in 1991, he wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine satirizing the Quebec language laws and its tongue troopers. The reaction was amazing. One Quebec politician even foamed that he should be arrested for treason. Did he back down? No. He expanded the article into a book entitled, "Oh, Canada, oh, Quebec." It was a huge success. He loved cigars and brandy and his wife and family, and as the music that began this section reminded us, he loved hockey, a real mensch. He was such a sports lover that at a party with a few friends, he celebrated his 70th birthday, 70 years and 10, with the shout, "Overtime!" Annie Bear. Annie Bear was born and raised in a bookish family, but she found such resistance to her rebellious work in conservative Quebec writing circles that in '54 she packed her bags and moved to Paris. Mavis Gallant found that living in Paris greatly hindered her career in Canada, not Annie Bear. From her Paris base till she came home in '97, she created a career that made her an absolute icon in Canadian and Quebec literature. She was hugely talented, a fine playwright and poet who won awards in many countries and was published in 10 different languages. And her greatest novel, for many readers simply the greatest Canadian novel ever written in French, was Kamouraska, translated into English in '73. It's based on a real murder story in 19th century Quebec. Here the central figure, Elizabeth, remembers how she and her American lover, Dr. Nelson, killed her brutal husband, the Seigneur of Kamouraska, northeast of Quebec on the South Shore. She survived the 1839 trial because the dead man's family wanted to avoid scandal, and blame was fixed on her servant, who had indeed tried to poison him. Now, however, 18 years later, Elizabeth has married a plump Quebec notary who's about to die, freeing her, perhaps, to go on as a respectable grieving widow, or to seek out her lover, the doctor who killed the seigneur and then fled to Vermont. Over one long night, as her second husband lies dying, she takes us through her life in brief, dramatic sentences that read like a telegram. And the point of view shifts so that we see scenes from the eyes of the dying man, or the brutal but very sexy first husband, or the maid being coached in how to poison him. It's a superb book, full of old Quebec details of parlours and streets and sleigh rides and fashionable balls. As some of you may remember, that Kamouraska made a superb movie by Paul Almond with Geneviève Bujold as the murderess and heroine combined. And as that implies, murderess and heroine, the book is a challenging masterpiece. Jack Hudgens. Born in the Comox Valley, this is a man who put Vancouver Island on Canada's literary map. His first book, Spit Delaney's Island, made readers across the country sit up. His first novel, 1977, The Invention of the World, had an international impact. Suddenly, the magic realism that was associated with Latin America, and especially with 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, had come to Canada, arriving in a wild BC version that involved loggers and chainsaws and much hooting and whooping. In Manhattan, Gordon Lish, the respected fiction editor of Esquire magazine, wrote that Jack Hodgins' Invention of the World joins Robertson Davies' Fifth Business as the decade's most distinguished achievements in Canadian fiction. As you can see from Tony Jenkins' portrait, Jack's a very nice guy, and he's known as Jack to everyone. Stories cluster around him. Once, for example, he went to the Yukon on a Canada Council authors tour. The bush planes flew so far north that Jack claims they saw herds of migrating caribou. When they reached the mining town, they had to work hard to find the key to the library where he was to give a reading, Spreading Culture. As 2:00 arrived, it became clear that the audience was going to consist of one man, the Anglican priest in full regalia, as for a wedding or a funeral. When Jack said, "Well, I guess we'd better get started," the priest sat front and center. And when Jack mounted the stage to begin, the man of God threw his arms wide and said, "Now you know how I feel every Sunday morning in this town." Margaret Atwood. When Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013, a Canadian woman in England went very proudly to her next London, England, book club meeting. All of the intelligent members were delighted by the award, saying that Alice was so good, that she really deserved it, that it was a great thing for the short story and a great thing for Canada, because, they went on, Canada didn't really have any other major fiction writers. Our Canadian friend said that wasn't quite true. To give just one example, there was Margaret Atwood. No, they chorused. Margaret Atwood is one of us. She's British. Think about what that means. For 30 or 40 years, we should remember that The Handmaid's Tale came out more than 30 years ago, they've been aware of Margaret Atwood's work. They've been reading her novels. They've been so aware, in fact, that she's been part of their lives, one of them. She is, in fact, a major international literary figure, and she's one of us. It's hard to find a single book to recommend. There are so many, and they're so different. But I was proud to publish Margaret's books, perhaps especially Alias Grace, which takes us back like Anniver's Kamarasca, based on an 1839 trial, into the details of a famous 1843 murder, where perhaps justice was not done in this controversial Upper Canadian case, now, as you know, very well serialized on CBC TV. Another story about just how Canadian Margaret is. I happened to be in Ottawa when she was giving a reading from her latest novel at the National Library. In the green room beforehand, she talked to me about how enthusiastic her audiences were in the United States compared with Canada. She went out and gave her usual even, low-key reading, and at the end, scores of people lined up to buy her book and get it signed, as people will line up in scores to get my books here. I joined the end of the queue, and when my turn came, I said enthusiastically, "Margaret, that was not bad." She was crushed. "Oh, Doug," she said, "I was really hoping for not bad at all." Real Canadian. We're lucky to have her. Yves Beauchemin. If your main language is English, you're probably wishing that you could come to grips with some of the Quebec books I've been talking so excitedly about. Look no further. La Matou is the book for you. This is not a crazy idea. When the English translation, The Alley Cat, came out in '86, Alberto Mangal reviewed it in the Globe and Mail as the best novel to appear in Canada or the United States for a very long time. Stop and consider that. The praise around the world was similar. It sold more than 1.5 million copies in 18 languages, maybe 2 million copies by now. It established Yves Beauchemin as a major writer, one of our very best. Why is this book so good? Part of the appeal is the basic story, where Montreal's Florent Bissonnot, at the age of 25, is given the chance to drop his boring sales job at Moosey Pop and follow a dream that many of us have, that it might be fun to own and run a restaurant. He takes over a La Binerie, a small, cramped East End eatery that specializes in traditional Quebec fare, and through nerve-wracking, often very funny adventures, he makes it work. You'll find that this is the sort of novel that supposedly nobody writes anymore. People compared it to Dickens or Balzac or Gogol. And the comedy here is truly divine, with literally dozens of lively, interesting characters. Some of them are almost as interesting as Yves Beauchemin himself. Born in Noranda, raised in Joliette, he went to university in Montreal and basically never left the city, working there until, as a writer, he became the great narrator of Montreal life. After this book, he went on to write a number of other fine novels, some of which I published, getting to know the charming, lively Yves very well. As the president of the Quebec Writers' Union, he played an active role in causes dear to his heart. Most notably, he did what he could to advance the cause of Quebec independence. We had many friendly disagreements about that, but I'm certainly glad to belong to a country that can produce a man like Yves Beauchemin. You'll enjoy his book. Michael Ondaatje. Michael was born in Sri Lanka into a rich, eccentric family that he is affectionately described in Running in the Family. When the family split up, he went with his mother to England in '54, acquiring a high school education and an English accent that he still retains. With his tanned good looks and hair that is now the color of wood smoke, he proved to be very attractive to women readers down through the years. He came to Canada in '62 to study at Bishop's University, and there I can tell you he gained undying local fame by falling in love with a professor's wife, eloping with her, and then marrying her. In hippie Toronto, he became a teacher at York University and a man who plunged into the unpromising fields of literary publishing, film, theatre, and poetry. He was such a good poet, winning 2 Governor-General's Awards for his 7 collections over the years, that when he began to write fiction, his poetry flowed into it. We can see it in every page of his novel, In the Skin of a Lion, set in Toronto in the 1920s. Above all, we can see it in his most famous novel, The English Patient. This 1992 novel was brilliantly described by the Vancouver Sun as a book that blends history with mirage. In Canada, it won the Governor-General's Award, and in Britain, it became the very first Canadian book to win the Booker Prize. The setting here is very far from Bloor Street, since it's Tuscany at the end of the Second World War. In a ruined villa, a Canadian nurse and a Canadian thief, his thumbs cut off by resentful Germans, along with a Sikh bomb dismantler, are brought together to watch over a badly burned, dying man named simply the English Patient. We learn about his pre-war scholarly work in the African desert, useful background in the Desert War, but he remains a fascinating mystery. It's a superb piece of work, poetic of course, but also marked by Michael's ability to tell you not just what his characters see and hear, but also what their bodies are feeling. He is truly our great sensual writer, writing, as they say in the sports pages, out of his skin. The book, as you know, became a major movie, winning 9 Oscars. Rohinton Mystery. A Toronto newspaper man born around 1940 wrote that he grew up knowing that someday someone would write the great Canadian novel. But, he confessed, I never expected it to be set in Bombay. That was the impact of Rohinton Mystery's first novel, Such a Long Journey, when it came out in 1991, winning the Governor-General's Award and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best Book, and many other prizes. Clearly, a new star had risen in Canada. Rohinton knew Bombay very well. Born in 1952, he grew up in the Parsi community there before emigrating to Canada in 1975, working in a bank and then getting a degree from the U of T. After Such a Long Journey, his writing career took off like a rocket. Just 4 years later, in 1995, his second novel, A Fine Balance, came out and won almost every prize going, including the Killer Prize and the Commonwealth Prize again. Reviewers around the world were entranced. The Washington Post called him a master storyteller, while the Independent in Britain called him simply a writer of genius. A Fine Balance is set in Bombay, now Mumbai, in 1973 during Indira Gandhi's state of emergency. Rohinton is a quiet, dignified man, and his genius allows him to quietly show us how these great affairs of state affect the lives of ordinary people. In this case, we follow 2 low-caste Hindu tailors driven out of their village and their families murdered because they dared to work for a Muslim. In the city, they stay with a Parsi landlady who initially looks down on them, and then, as she sees their terrible life, where they're forced to go to work in a work camp and then to undergo sterilization, with the help of her tolerant Parsi nephew, she comes to realize that they are all sailing under one flag. We come to care about all of them more and more as they struggle with the problems of caste and poverty in a vicious world that's stacked against them. This is a very tough, hard-hitting book that you will never forget, one that brings the worst problems in the world right up against your face and doesn't let us look away. The woman's voice you just heard singing was that of Ada Butler, the remarkable Acadian singer who has gained fame around the world. Ada was such a larger-than-life, feisty figure that Antonin Maillet once said that when she created the heroine of her greatest novel, Pélagie la Charrette, she modelled her on Edith Butler. Antonine herself was born in Bouctouche in northern New Brunswick, along the Acadian shore. She devoted her life to studying and writing about her people, the Acadians. These were French-speaking settlers who came as early as 1604 to what is now the Maritimes. They were different from the people who settled in Quebec. They came from a different part of France, further south in Poitou, and spoke a very different kind of French. And that's what Antonine Maillet, with her doctorate in literature and folklore, chose to write in. Her famous novel, Pélagie, deals with the central event in Acadian history. In 1755, as we saw, these French-speaking farmers, despite trying very hard to stay neutral in the colonial wars, were rounded up at gunpoint by English redcoats from Boston and expelled in a piece of, ethnic cleansing that became known as the Grand Dérangement. A few escaped into the woods, but most were shipped in crowded holds down the east coast of America and dropped off in states like South Carolina or Georgia to fend for themselves. Pélagie is a wild, inspiring, tall tale of how our middle-aged heroine got some carts, pulled by oxen, and gathered up Acadian families to take them home. As the carts creak north from Georgia, out of the woods spill Cormiers and Leblancs and Landrys and Bellevaux, all eager to head home after 30 years in exile. The American Revolution rages around them as they plod north, so the book is full of drama until they finally make it all the way, some of them, to beyond the Tantamar marshes and into the land of Acadie. The book was such a huge worldwide success that it won for Antonine Maillet, who now lives on a Montreal street named after her, the Prix Goncourt. It was, in fact, the first time that this great French prize had gone to a writer not born in France. In her acceptance speech, remembering how her people were abandoned, Antonine Maillet said, "J'ai vengé mes ancêtres. I have avenged my ancestors." Scotland's Books is the title of the complete Penguin survey by Robert Crawford of the Great University of St. Andrews. It calls Alistair MacLeod's only novel, No Great Mischief, a great Scots-Canadian novel by a writer nurtured by the Gaelic-speaking community of Cape Breton. And the Scottish music we've just heard, Neil Gow's Lament, played at a funeral in the book, catches the emotional power of his writing. And his novel won many prizes, including the Worldwide Impact Award, at the time the richest prize for a book in the English-speaking world. Alistair's people came from Scotland to Cape Breton around 1790, and the family still summers in Cape Breton. He spent his life as a professor in Windsor, Ontario, where he and Anita raised 6 lively children. I should mention that tomorrow the University of Windsor is opening an Alistair MacLeod Memorial Walk, and Jane and I will be there with the MacLeod family. He was a busy man, raising 6 lively children with Anita, and that busy life for this sturdy, flat cap-wearing man who looked, some said, like a farmer come to town to sell cows meant that he only wrote one short story a year. But his stories were so remarkable that his two collections became famous around the world. So when word got out that Alistair was at work on a novel, people in Sydney, Australia were as interested as people in Sydney, BC, or Sydney, Nova Scotia. And he worked away at it for 13 long years until a villainous publisher named Gibson flew to Windsor to grab Alistair's manuscript in what the writer once mischievously described as a home invasion. The book came out in 1999 and went on to be a huge success in Canada and around the world. The Japanese edition led to a stream of tourists tracking Alistair to his Cape Breton cottage. And when they met, the lack of a common language meant that they just bowed like that, which was enough. What makes this such a great book is that it sweeps across centuries and wars, from Robert the Bruce fighting the English invaders in 1314 to James Wolfe using his Highland troops as cannon fodder at Quebec, noting that it would be no great mischief if they fall. And yet the story deals with ordinary working men, hard rock miners in this case, and their families. Their stories are told in the hypnotic, slow language that has entranced millions of readers, every perfect word chiseled in stone, till the last line, all of us are better when we're loved. Danny Leferrier, and I'm sorry, a technical something or other. We missed out Marie-Claire Blais. But here we are with Danny Leferrier, who was born in Haiti and bravely tried to be a journalist in Port-au-Prince under the dictatorship of Jean-Claude Duvalier. When his colleague was assassinated in 1978, Danny barely escaped with his life and fled to Canada. His life as a writer here was difficult until in 1985 he produced his daring novel, How to Make Love to a Negro Without Getting Tired. It's a lively series of encounters in a bohemian part of Montreal where two things are central. Money is always short in the cheap, sweaty apartments where our hero and his friend Booba hang out. And equally important, as young black guys, they're constantly under siege by white women who desperately want to prove their immunity from racism. Danny Leferrier has amusing, sarcastic fun with the racial stereotypes involved. Indeed, some of the sex scenes with the woman he calls Ms. McGill, and I'm sure you enjoyed seeing the McGill painting by Laurie Campbell, where she is a prosperous student with daddy's money advancing her education. Very impressive. The book was a huge success and launched Danny into a major career. In 1990, he left Montreal for Miami, and then as he wrote many other books and won prizes in France and elsewhere, his reputation grew around the world, and he came home to Montreal in 2002. In 2016, last year, his international standing was recognized when he was received into l'Académie Française, where membership is restricted to 40 immortals at a time. So our Danny Leferrier is now officially immortal, and we are pleased. 150 years ago, we began by looking at Skye as an example of our great Indigenous storytellers. But what nowadays is an Indigenous storyteller, now that happily more and more writers from the Aboriginal world are coming forward? It's complicated. Let me draw your attention to the mischievous title of Drew Hayden Taylor's book, Funny You Don't Look Like One, Observations from a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe. Think hard about that. Who exactly qualifies as an Aboriginal writer. Clearly, this is not territory with neat edges. Which brings us to this man, Joseph Boyden. He was born and raised in Willowdale. He is a mix of Anishinaabe, Irish, and Scottish heritage. After a degree from York University, he found himself more and more interested in the part of his family background that was native. He moved north to James Bay to teach in the Northern College Aboriginal program, which was, as he said, a life-changing experience. His 3 novels, 3-Day Road, Through Black Spruce, and The Orenda, have all won major prizes. They all have Indigenous themes and Indigenous characters. But is Joseph Boyden really an Indigenous writer? That has become the big question. I don't know the answer to that question. It's not for me to say. But if we change it to a different question, has Joseph Boyden's writing revealed to many Canadian readers the important role of Indigenous Canadians in our country, in our country's history? My answer is a resounding yes. The Orenda is set in 17th century Canada when white missionaries, the Jesuit black robes, are involved in the wars between Aboriginal groups like the Hurons and the Algonquins. We follow these wars through the eyes of 3 characters, one from each group, and we watch in horror as Joseph takes us through the brutality of such warfare. My friend at the University of Ottawa, the Huron-Wyandot scholar Georges Suey, has praised the book's accuracy, saying that, quote, master novelist Joseph Boyden enables the reader to see through native eyes the immense human tragedies that attended the birth of North American nation states. Perhaps the last word about the Orenda should go to the Vancouver Sun. This is a staggering, masterful work, a stunning, masterful work of staggering depth, possibly the first truly great novel of this century. And in 2015, for his important work in helping to emphasize the true Indigenous roots of our country, Joseph Boyden became a member of the Order of Canada. This survey is not called Canada's greatest novelist because of Alice Munro, for Alice wrote short stories, no novels. Her supposed only novel, Lives of Girls and Women, is really a collection of linked short stories. When it came out in 1971, you see, publishers were still terrified of short stories because people believed they didn't sell. When I met Alice in 1974 in this city, I was thrilled to have lunch with her here. She had published 3 books, and I could see that they were so good that her career was going like that. What I found, however, was that her writing career was in crisis. Everyone, other writers, book reviewers, booksellers, publishers, everyone was telling her to stop writing short stories and to write novels. Nobody will take you seriously as a short story writer, they all said. And because everyone was saying it, she believed them. So she had stopped writing short stories and was trying to write a novel. But the change of pace meant she was finding it hard. She was blocked, as they say, unable to write at all. So I said, Alice, if everyone is telling you to stop writing short stories, they're all wrong. You're a great short story writer. I'm a publisher. If you were to spend the rest of your life writing short stories, I'd be delighted to publish them, and I'd never, ever ask you for a novel. Well, since then, starting with The Progress of Love in 1978, we've published 12 collections of short stories together. And with the Nobel Prize for Literature going to Alice, I guess you could say it has worked out not too badly. Alice grew up as Alice Laidlaw in Huron County in southwestern Ontario, where boasting and showing off are the worst things you can do. So she has always stayed modest and low-key, even when she was winning the world's biggest prizes for her books. I remember once I visited Trinity College, Dublin, where Alice was about to receive the International Man Booker Prize for her life's work. At the Long Room in the famous library, the literary greats of Europe were standing around chatting excitedly. Alice was sitting off by herself, quietly. I asked, "Why aren't you out there mingling before you get this great prize?" The woman from Huron County said darkly, "They might change their mind." They did not change their mind. Alice's stories have been set in Scotland, in Australia, in Russia, even in Albania. A good number are set in BC, but most are set in what the whole world now knows as Alice Munro country, the flat farmland dotted with small towns that run east of Godrich and Lake Huron. It's attractive land, but unremarkable country with no mountains or deserts, and no history of great battles. And the people who live there are ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, librarians, chambermaids. Yet the magic of storytelling, what we're thinking about today, allows Alice to make these ordinary people sit down in a very particular, very ordinary place into universal characters. In Stockholm at the Nobel Prize ceremony, my wife asked a bright Swedish woman why she loved Alice Munro's writing. She replied, "Because she makes me wonder, how does she know how I feel?" That's our Alice Munro. Sweden's Alice Munro, the world's Alice Munro. Thank you very much.